Let me ask you something. When was the last time you bought a Bethesda game and genuinely expected it to work properly at launch? Take a second, think about it. If you're like most people, you can't actually remember, because at some point without realizing it, you stopped expecting it and you just accepted it. You figured, it's Bethesda, the game will be broken, mods will fix it, it'll be fine. When did that happen? When did we all collectively decide that one of the biggest RPG studios in the world didn't need to ship a working game? The uncomfortable answer is that Bethesda didn't make that decision. We did. And we've been making it over and over again for 30 years at this point. To understand how we got here, we need to go back further than most people would expect. Not to Skyrim or Oblivion, not even Morrowind. We need to go to 1996, The Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall. Daggerfall was an insanely ambitious game for its time. We're talking about a procedurally generated world roughly the size of Great Britain. For comparison's sake, Daggerfall's map was about 4,000 times bigger than Skyrim. It had hundreds of thousands of NPCs, a deep character system, and a main questline where your choices change the endings and how the NPCs treat you. For a 1996 RPG, it was staggering in scope. It was also, to put it charitably, a disaster at launch. The game shipped with a bug that made the questline literally unfinishable. Players nicknamed it Buggerfall. And yet, and this is the important part, people loved it anyway. Because underneath the broken mess was something nobody else was building. A world that felt genuinely alive, genuinely massive, genuinely unlike anything else at the time. So players forgave it. Of course they did. The ambition was real, the passion was real, and frankly, in 1996, from a small studio swinging for the fences, a buggy launch felt like an acceptable trade-off for something that ambitious. The forgiveness was completely reasonable, but Bethesda noticed. Morrowind came next, in 2002, buggy, beloved, forgiven. Oblivion in 2006, buggy, beloved, forgiven. Fallout 3 in 2008, particularly brutal on PlayStation 3, where the game would essentially collapse under its own weight after extended periods of playing. Buggy, beloved, forgiven. You're starting to see the pattern, right? Each time, Bethesda launched a broken game. Each time, the audience embraced it anyway. Each time, the commercial results were strong enough that there was no real incentive for them to do things differently. And each time, the implicit message sent back to Bethesda was the same. We'll take it. Whatever state it's in, we'll take it. Think about that from Bethesda's perspective for a second. So you're a studio, you ship a game, it's buggy, critics mention it, players complain on forums, and then the game sells millions of copies anyway. What lesson do you learn from that? You learn that the bugs don't matter. Not commercially. Not really. But eventually, I think it was Skyrim in 2011 that cemented everything. Skyrim sold 30 million copies. It became a cultural phenomenon. Your aunt knew what Skyrim was. People who had never played a video game in their lives knew about Skyrim. And it launched, as you probably remember, with a genuinely impressive collection of bugs. Mammoths falling from the sky, giants sending players into orbit, dragons flying backwards, the PS3 version degrading into a slideshow after enough hours. And nobody cared. Not really, because Skyrim was magic and the bugs were just part of the experience. And that's the moment everything changed. Not because Skyrim was the buggiest Bethesda game, it actually wasn't, but because Skyrim's success was so enormous, so disproportionate to any reasonable quality standard, that it essentially proved something Bethesda had been suspecting for 15 years, that for their games, polish was optional. 30 million people had told them so. There's a moment in Game of Thrones, and bear with me here, this is kind of relevant, where Tyrion Lannister finally understands what he's been part of. He's watched Daenerys free slaves, defeat tyrants, and build something that looked from the outside like justice. And everyone around her, including Tyrion, cheered every conquest, praised every decision, celebrated every victory by Daenerys. And then she burned King's Landing to the ground. And Tyrion's realization, standing there in the ashes, is that she didn't change. She was always this. Every conquest They'd cheer. Every city she had taken, every enemy she had destroyed, they'd been training her, teaching her that fire solves problems, that overwhelming force is always justified. Tyrion said every time she did that, we'd cheer her on. And he's right. They built the monster together. I think about Bethesda a lot when I think about that scene, because we did the same thing. Every time Bethesda shipped a broken game and we bought it anyway, we cheered them on. Every time a modder fixed what the developers didn't and we thanked the modder while still giving Bethesda a pass, we cheered them on. Every time we said, well, it's Bethesda, what do you expect? And laughed it off like it was an endearing quirk and not a professional failure, we cheered them on. And Bethesda learned exactly the lesson we taught them. Here's something that I think should be acknowledged though. The modding community is extraordinary. The people who have spent thousands of hours of their own time fixing bugs, rebuilding systems, adding content, they do it out of genuine love for these worlds. That's real and that matters. But the system these modders operate inside benefits Bethesda in a way that's never quite been named directly. Bethesda ships the broken canvas, modders paint over the cracks. And Bethesda gets credit for a living, breathing game with incredible community support. The modders get a thank you in Developer Direct. Meanwhile, Bethesda has essentially had free quality assurance for 3 decades, provided by fans who love the games too much to leave them broken. Of course, that's not the modder's fault, but it is a dynamic worth understanding, because as long as that pipeline exists, broken game ships, community fixes it, everyone moves on, Bethesda has no reason to change. Pipeline removes the consequence. Daggerfall taught them bugs don't kill sales. Morrowind confirmed it. Oblivion confirmed it again. Skyrim made it a doctrine. Fallout 4 made it policy. I want to pause on Fallout 4 in 2015 because it wasn't another buggy Bethesda launch. I mean, of course it was, but it was also something more revealing. Fallout 4 launched with the usual collection of bugs and performance issues, but the more telling story was what Bethesda had quietly decided to remove. Real dialogue choices, reduced to 4 buttons. A voiced protagonist that made genuine full roleplay nearly impossible. Special, the stats system that had defined Fallout since 1997 turned into a glorified perk vending machine. Bethesda didn't just ship a broken game, they shipped a simplified game. And the lesson they learned from Skyrim, that accessibility beats depth, that a wider audience forgives more than a dedicated audience, that lesson was now being applied to not just bugs, but to the entire design philosophy. Fallout 4 sold over 15 million copies in its first month. The simplification was vindicated commercially, just like the bugs before it. Polish was optional, and depth, as it turned out, that was optional too. And then came Fallout 76. If there was ever a moment that should have broken the cycle, it was November 2018. Fallout 76 launched in a state that, from any other studio, would have been career-ending. Server instability, game-breaking bugs, a loot system that didn't work, a map that felt empty in ways that felt intentional, not even ambitious. The canvas bag fiasco, where a $200 collector's edition promised a canvas bag and shipped a cheap nylon one instead. And Bethesda's initial response was basically, oops, sorry, canvas was too expensive. A data breach that exposed customer personal information, a $100 per year private server subscription. This wasn't ambitious but rough. Now, this was a studio that stopped trying to hide the fact that it had stopped trying. The community actually pushed back harder than it ever had before. The reviews were brutal, the memes were merciless, and for a moment, it really looked like this was the launch that would finally teach Bethesda the lesson that 30 years of forgiveness hadn't. And then Bethesda patched it. They added Wastelanders, they added NPCs, they fixed enough of the worst problems that the conversation slowly changed from "this is a disaster" to "actually it's pretty decent now." And the community, being the community, forgave them. And look, I'm not saying Fallout 76's recovery was not real. It was. But think about what that recovery actually taught Bethesda. It taught them that even their worst launch is survivable, that if you patch enough, wait long enough, and add enough content, the audience will come back, that there is apparently no floor, no launch bad enough that the fanbase won't eventually find a way to love it. Fallout 76 should have been the end of the cycle, and instead it became proof that the cycle was unbreakable. And then came Starfield in 2023, Bethesda's big bet, a new IP, a new universe, but basically the same formula. Wide open worlds, low friction, accessible to everyone. Todd Howard called it Skyrim in space. And for the first time, the formula didn't work. And not because Bethesda did something dramatically different, but because Starfield's audience didn't spend 30 years being conditioned to forgive them. The people who came to Starfield fresh, without the nostalgia, without the history, without the emotional investment in the brand, they just saw a game that was empty and broken, and they said no. The Bethesda faithful found ways to defend it, as they always do, but the broader audience walked away. For the first time, the cycle showed a crack. Not quite enough to break it, but enough to see through it. Which brings us to November 2025, the Fallout 4 Anniversary Edition update. And this is where I need to make a distinction that I think gets lost in the general Bethesda bad conversation, because not all broken is the same. Everything we've talked about up until this point, Daggerfall's unfinishable questline, Skyrim's backwards dragons and mammoths falling from the sky, Fallout 76's empty world, that was all broken new things, buggy launches, ambitious games shipped before they were ready. Inexcusable by professional standards, but at least explicable. You could draw a line between the ambition and the breakage and understand, even if you didn't forgive, how one leads to another. Fallout 4 Anniversary Edition was different. Categorically, qualitatively different. This was not a new game shipped rough. This was a mandatory update, one you couldn't really opt out of, pushed to an existing game that people had already bought a decade earlier and already paid for DLCs on. And it broke the content. PlayStation players lost access to expansions they'd owned for years. Saves corrupted. DLC stopped registering. Creation Club content crashed the game. For 3 months, a significant portion of the player base simply couldn't play a game they owned, they bought, with content they purchased through no fault of their own. No refunds, no opt-out, no meaningful communication, just silence and a patch that came months later and fixed a lot of it, most but not all of it, without a single acknowledgement of what had been taken from people in the meantime. Think about what that means. The old Bethesda broke things they were building. This Bethesda broke things they had already sold you. That's not a bug. That's negligence towards paying customers. And even by Bethesda standards, it represents something new. Even by the standards of a studio that shipped Daggerfall in 1996 and Fallout 76 in 2018, this was a new low. Because this time they didn't just fail to build something properly. They reached back into your library and broke what was already there. And yet here we are. The cycle continues. The next game will come, the hype will build, and a lot of players, if we're being honest, will probably buy it. Which brings me back to the question I asked at the beginning. When did we first accept that a Bethesda game would be broken at launch? When did you? And it turns out the answer doesn't matter, because the more important question is what we're going to do the next time. Bethesda is not going to change because we are frustrated. They're not going to change because the memes are funny, or because Reddit threads are angry or the YouTube videos are critical. They're going to change when the one thing that has never happened finally happens. When a Bethesda launch underperforms badly enough that the financial case for shipping broken games collapses. This has not happened as of yet. And until it does, if it does, nothing we've talked about in this video actually matters. Bethesda didn't train us to accept broken games. We have trained them to keep making them. The only question left is whether we're willing to stop.